Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another Open Security Summit session on Secure by Scenario. In this one, we will be guided by James, and he will show us how he creates these scenarios and how he runs them so that we can replicate it in our organizations. Over to you, James.
Okay. First of all, if I say anything that you disagree with, have questions about, want to dig into, just interrupt and ask. Works much better that way than saving questions to the end. I'm happy to go off on tangents to a point, and we can always take it to a separate chat or finish a conversation later. So this is a little workshop I've built up called Playing at Security, which is about some work we started off with OSS earlier this year, about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, years ago, sometime in 2020.
Less than 6 months.
less. Oh right, okay. It just feels longer. Started earlier this year to give people an opportunity to explore some instant response scenarios. I know some of you have been through these workshops already, or been through some of the scenarios already. So you've got an idea of what we're aiming for, but this is essentially my thought process when I first built the first one and how I got there, and the steps I go through to give a new starting scenario to build one up. So if I can get PowerPoint to actually respond. First things first, while these scenarios do have a lot in common with games, and I've got no problem with them being called games, it's not the same thing as gamification. Gamification often involves a scoreboard or game mechanics being brought into some sort of learning process or some sort of process to make it competitive. This is not designed to give you a scenario where it's competitive. It's not designed so that you will have one group who come out of the scenario and they have won. The whole point is to explore the scenario, to see how different paths will take you, and to learn from that, and that's to learn collectively from it. So it's not a case of, oh, the red team have won because they got the ransom. It is a case of, okay, so that happened. That's an area you've now explored. You can take it further. You can rewind and do something else, but it's not winning and losing. It's also not about fun. So while I've gathered from people that these are fun, certainly for the people who aren't running them, but while I've gathered they are fun, that is not the aim of this. The aim of it is for it to be fulfilling, for it to be engaging, and for it to be immersive. So fun is somewhere off to the side. It might be a side effect, but it's not a goal. What it is about is giving people the opportunity to safely fail at whatever it is you're exploring. And that really is the whole point. If you make some of the calls that you can make in these scenarios in real life, there are going to be very negative consequences. So it's giving a safe place to make those calls because you've not got the experience, you've not been through, you've not seen the consequences, so that you learn to make different ones or to pursue a different path. Or possibly you've decided actually that risk is worth taking. There will be an impact, but it's a lesser impact than an alternative. So it's all about giving that opportunity to fail safely. And it is about play and games. These scenarios are about play. You should explore when you're in teams, and you should expect the people you're running it for to explore and play with different ideas and play with different paths. You want to try and avoid limiting people as much as you can, because they will surprise you repeatedly. Except possibly the red team, it is worth putting in some very tight constraints on them, but we'll get to that. And it is effectively a game. And an important bit of that is to understand what play and what games really mean. So Bernard Suits, probably the first game philosopher, came up with this definition, that to play a game is to attempt to achieve a specific state of affairs, the pre-illusory goal, using only means permitted by rules, the illusory means, where the rules prohibit use of more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. That is quite literally what we're doing with these scenarios. There is a goal, which is to explore the scenario. It doesn't have to be win-loss. There are rules. The rules are very open, very flexible, but there are rules. The means are inefficient because the most efficient way to get to the goal would just be to read through a script. And we are doing it this way because it makes it possible, because that makes it valuable. So just a quick philosophical interlude, and I do apologize for those who aren't interested in philosophy.
So James, do you want questions during or at the end?
During is fine.
So if you go back a slide, on this one, is one of the ways to make this successful is to define those, almost what's the objectives, right?
Yes.
So I would say that one of the key objectives here is to test existing, for them, playbooks and educate the multiple players into, you know, maybe the security thinking that is required, right?
Yep. So if you've got existing playbooks, if you've got existing technologies, controls in place, those become essentially your game board. There's something that you can work with. You set rules according to what you've got, and you follow those rules, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense, because you could say, oh, well, we'll just put something else in, and that means that's not an option. You try to make it simulationist. You try to stick to reality so that it becomes useful.
Well, yeah, and in that case, right, I would say that the success, the more this can be run in a company environment, the more those rules match the real world, the more successful it will be, right? Because
yes,
any gaps you find are gaps that, you know, will occur in the real world. And in a way, you get to preempt those problems by running a simulation. And in fact, you could argue that if you run the same simulation with the same, you know, scenario 3 times in a row over 3 months, you expect to see an improvement in the team's performance, right?
Yep. And I would argue if you've run the same scenario, say 6 times, and the team's got really good at it and don't make any real mistakes, that's where it's time to come up with a new scenario. Because the whole point is to find those failures, find those limited communications, gaps in your processes, gaps in your controls, highlight them and fix them.
Yeah, good.
Bit more on philosophy. So there's various other definitions of a game. We can largely skip past these, but McGonagall has a good one where games share 4 defining traits, and as Dennis just picked out, they've got a goal, they've got rules, they've got a feedback system, and they've got voluntary participation. If it's not voluntary participation, it's not a game, it's work. So, goals of classic board games and computer games, you will have build, where you're trying to construct something, control, where you're trying to take over territory. So if you know the game Go, that's a version of a control game. Destroy, where you are trying to, well, destroy something. Negation is where you are trying to shut down an opposing player's strategy so that they can make no further moves. Race is just trying to get to an endpoint fastest. Solve is a puzzle scenario, and spatial is a spatial game of some kind that could be building blocks or anything else. It doesn't necessarily have all of the same goals. Those are the ones you would be taught in a game design course. They are fantastic if you're designing a computer game or a board game, because you can just pick out whichever one you want to go for. When we're looking at a security scenario that we want to run through, there are 6 of the goals really that are relevant. We can ignore spatial unless you want to go full on hire an office building and start doing one there, which I would love to do, but not right at the moment. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at building, you're going to be looking at control of territory, networks, you're going to be looking at destruction, denial of service, destroying assets, you're going to be looking at negation, trying to close down access to environments, you will be looking at race conditions. The first one to be able to log in or to think of accessing a particular asset will be the one who wins, for want of a better word. And you will be looking at solving puzzles. You're trying to work out what is going on so that you can be one step ahead and so that you can control potential damages. Now, there's different approaches to rules in games, and this is one aimed at role-playing games. more than other kinds. So you have gamist rules, you have narrativist, and you have simulationist. A gamist approach goes very heavy on the game. Chess, for example, is a very gamist game. It's focused on the mechanics and it's all about playing within those mechanics. A simulationist game would be maybe something more like Laser Quest, where you're trying to get close to a reality. Admittedly, you're getting close to a reality where you're shooting at each other with lasers, but there's not many rules that don't contribute directly to that. However, with those, the moment you go more abstract, you end up piling more and more rules on top to reflect reality and force people to adhere to it. And then there's the narrativist approach. Now, humans are storytelling animals. We like stories, we hook into stories, and we pretty much understand the world through stories and narratives. The narrativist approach in games gives that story arc to a scenario, and it works on that storytelling method to work through the scenario. And I promise this will make more sense and seem relevant in a bit. Now, the feedback system is the next bit we need to look at. And this is a very reduced version of what's called the hero's journey or the monomyth. There's 12 stage versions, there's 7 stage versions, but really they boil down to this. You establish a story, you undergo a crisis, you reach a new equilibrium, and then you can return to establishing the story again. And as Dennis called out earlier, that's exactly what you're doing if you're rerunning the scenarios, because you're establishing the story, you're saying this is where we're starting, you go through the crisis, you learn the lessons, you build up to make sure that those same mistakes aren't made, and then you repeat it again. And the reason for pulling this out is because these types of scenarios are fundamentally narrativist. The idea is you are telling a story, it's a collaborative story with lots of stakeholders involved in telling it, but that is what you are doing. And voluntary participation. So I did say if it's not voluntary participation, it doesn't count, but bribery does count as voluntary participation. So donuts are fine. Right, moving on from that. How do we actually play this? So what's our goal? We want to explore failure modes in a way that we're not suffering from the consequences of them. Simple as that. It's very clear. We want to find out what could go wrong without it going wrong. And how do we want to build our rules? Well, keeping score really won't help us because that doesn't tell us anything about the failure modes. We don't care who wins or loses. We care what's gone wrong and what we can fix next time. So we can ignore keeping score. That pretty much cuts out gamist rules. We want a usefully realistic scenario, but if you're going to replicate your entire network infrastructure and give the red team the tools that they need to penetrate it and get them to test against it, you are throwing so many resources into it that it's not going to be useful for this type of exercise. I'm not saying anything against purple teaming or full red teaming exercises. They're a brilliant idea, but you cannot knock one of those out in 2 hours on a quiet Friday afternoon. Whereas one of these you can work through and then you can run through it again on the Monday and learn from the lessons there. So it's a very lightweight, efficient way to do the same sort of testing, admittedly somewhat more limited, but the same sort of testing, the same sort of exercise you would get from a full red team effort that might take months otherwise.
James, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So, I mean, if you keep score, wouldn't that help you to manage like the crisis? Like, you know, if you're on the crisis mode and you keep the score, wouldn't that help you to manage and go through? Let's say if you score below 5, I'm not talking here score like football or something, it's just like you score below 5 and put up, wouldn't that help you ease the manage of managing your crisis?
The problem there is what you use to keep score. So that's where the issue comes in. You could assign arbitrary scores. You could say you did well, you did badly. You could say, well, these are the mistakes you made, or these are the ones where you had lesser or greater damage than you could have done. But to take one of the examples we had, it was a SQL injection attack against a fictional telco company where they'd got away with some personal data but nothing sensitive and started blasting it out to try and cause chaos. At that point, have they won? Do they get a high score because they've already revealed the data? Because that doesn't really help us with the scenario. Equally, for the blue team people in that one, if they manage the press correctly, how do we score that? So the problem with setting a score or keeping a score is that you're working with a very abstract scenario where a failure is obvious and a success is obvious, but you can't really quantify that easily. And if you are trying to translate that to some sort of scoring mechanism, you're putting a lot of work into managing that scoring mechanism, which could be put into the scenario instead. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, you could absolutely do this keeping score. Don't get me wrong. I just recommend against it because it takes effort away from the scenario itself. It
Yeah,
will
I'll just say
also...
on that one, I think if you kind of look into the idea that there's a path here that teams have more and more mature playbooks, I think once you get there, you can kind of start to be more rational about that. So you could almost argue that, the more changes you have to do on playbooks, the less points you have, right? The more actions you can do with a playbook, the more points you have, right? I think
Yep.
there's a level of maturity that maybe the way I would look at this is saying score will become easier once you reach a certain level of maturity.
Yes, with the playbook, I was actually just about to jump in on that one. If, for example, you had a whole load of playbooks for the relevant scenario, you could do scoring based on how closely it was followed, for example. So once you've got controls in place, you could then do more effort on scoring, but at that point, you might want to be shifting or changing the scenario that you're working with to see if you can find holes elsewhere. So when you can get to keeping score, you are going to be getting decreasing returns from your effort put into it, which doesn't mean none, but it will be lower returns than when you're doing a completely new scenario, which will teach you a lot more.
Yep.
Okay. So
in a way, what we're doing here is the bare minimum of running these scenarios. So people, if they want to improve on it and change the methods, they can do so for their organizations. If you want to use your
yes.
playbooks, that's great. It's one other organization might not have them. They might apply it differently, and so.
Fundamentally, a lot of what I do is based on the fact that I am incredibly lazy and want to do the minimum amount of effort for the maximum return. So this is minimum how you can get to a scenario that is engaging, that is educational, and that is useful without doing any extra work. I do a whole thing on threat modeling about minimum effort as well, so it's not just on this. So building the rules we've covered, and our feedback system goes back to those narrative stages. So we set the story running with a crisis. We then go into the new equilibrium. What have we discovered? What are we going to improve for next time? What have we learned? And then we repeat. That is our feedback system. What comes out of the scenario is these things went wrong. How do we fix them for next time? And then in the next run of that same scenario, those things are now fixed. What else can go wrong? So building your scenario, the amount of planning effort involved. I know that there are frameworks out there that some larger companies have produced that do very detailed, very well scripted scenarios. And there are also other approaches. And you might guess which my favorite is fairly quickly. So you have a reenactment option. That's essentially rerunning a genuine instance. You might adapt it for a particular company to reflect their technologies, but you are doing a fully scripted exercise to try and educate people. The issue you'll have with that is people get less return from something they're not directly involved in. So if you're rerunning a scenario, you're going to be looking at basic awareness, but you're not going to have that same emotional hook and that same embedded response as you will with other options. You've then got a simulationist or simulation approach where you've got it partially scripted. You might have branching scripts. So you might say, if you shut down the server there, then the ransomware doesn't hit. Or if you contact your cyber response team, then this happens. And these are the ones that are generally available, and they are useful exercises. But there are problems with them in that they don't account for every possibility because it's very hard to do. And the difficulty with that is you won't be getting, again, that same emotional punch. It's a bit more abstract because your choices are so much more constrained. The advantage of a simulation approach is that anyone can be involved in running it. So if you've got a scripted out branching storyline, anyone can run it and you will get the same benefits as having someone experienced in running these things doing it. So if you think of a scripted murder mystery party where you have to reveal clues at a certain time and then you make accusations at another time, that would be an example of a simulation is partly scripted. All of the free choice is really just fluff and colouring around the edges, but you are still learning something.
So
And
Jane,
then
Andre commented
Andre,
saying,
yeah. Oh, sorry.
he would rename the simulation to story approach. From a scientific method approach, the simulation would look at a particular variable change for the entire simulation. Okay.
Yeah, this is Andre. Who's made a comment.
Yes, Andre.
What do you think, James?
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I might say script rather than story, and there is a reason for that. But yeah, that's basically saying we might change one variable. We might say this person's not available for the simulation. What does that mean? Then there's my favorite, as you might have guessed, which is the lazy approach, which is completely unscripted, gives almost complete freedom. And I call it the lazy approach. It's not entirely true because it does require a lot more work than the others when you're actually running the scenario. But it does give a much larger degree of openness. I think people who've been involved in these can attest to how intense and stressful they can be. And that's without much in the way of props, that's without any actual consequences and the full awareness that it is just a simulation. So I'm very much in favour of that one because it's the least preparation and it is the most impactful for educating people and giving that learning opportunity.
But it still works really well with the playbook scenario, right? Because what you're saying is that the red team and the management and some of those, you know, or even the scenario doesn't have to be 100% prepared. And again, the fact that we do multiple rounds helps with that, right? Because you never know which direction you're going to go. But the playbooks and the responses, ideally, they should be following the playbooks, right?
Yes. So if you've got playbooks and they're following them, then ideally that scenario will go almost the same way every time. It won't actually, because you can tweak it as you go. But the scenario itself doesn't have to be scripted. So you're following a playbook to navigate through it, but the scenario itself can change quite freely during that. For example, if you have an active red team participant, it depends entirely on their choices. And you may highlight some problems in your playbook because the red team decide to do something either clever or reckless or ignorant, or decide that they want to go completely offbeat and suddenly they just want to retire to the Bahamas, so they want to sell all of your data now instead of ransoming it. So that type of thing can really help explore the constraints and limits of a playbook and help you find the flaws in it.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm now going to take you through how I actually build up one of these scenarios, and it is just a few steps. So the first thing is planting a seed, and that can just be as simple as one sentence or a few words as the concept to run through. That might be ransomware attack, it might be USB drop, SQL injection, bribery, office assistant gone rogue, all sorts of things. But just a few words to get started. Then design the main character. Now, character's not quite the right word here, but you're talking about the company, the organization, the character you want to be at the center of the scenario. It will usually be the company under attack, where most of the stakeholders will come from there. And you can base it on a real company. If it's not a company you own or have senior management responsibilities in, I would suggest at least subtly changing the name to avoid potential problems, or develop a completely fictional company to explore other scenarios. And for open events, I will generally look at recent news stories and make a very clever change to certain names and certain details, and then run with that. Then design the stakeholders, similar to designing the company. These are the people who will take part. You can do it as a single team exercise where you've just got one team of the senior management in the company, for example, or each person representing different stakeholders, and you don't have an active red team and the central control then manages that red team themselves. Or you can have multiple teams. If you go down the multiple teams route, I highly recommend you have a blue team, which would be the technical, security, governance, whatever you want to call it team. They would be the hands-on side of things, and that's hands directly on the technology, whether that's solving the problem, whether they're support desk, however you want to describe it. They make a very good team in almost every scenario you want to play with. A red team, who are obviously your hostiles, and they will be reacting and proactively doing things to frankly mess up everyone's day. And a management or exec stakeholder team, because that layer of governance and the communication between them and the blue team is probably the biggest bottleneck you will hit in an actual scenario, and you will hit in one of these as well. So the need for that communication to be clear really comes out of these. Now you can then also add in some others. So you could throw in customer representation as another third party. You could put press, you could put a regulator in, managed service provider, whatever you want. You probably want 3 to 8 people per team. 8's the maximum, 4 or 5's probably about right. And you simply run them through that way. Once you've got your extra stakeholders and you've got all of your stakeholders planned out, and you've just got the names of the different teams down, you will want to make them a group. And whether that's saying, okay, you are step technical support, here is your logo, or it's saying you are the devil's hand ransomware cybercrime group, APT, etc., doesn't matter. But giving that group identity to a team, even if it's just as you're starting the scenario, really makes a huge difference to how people engage.
And during our scenarios, we made it very random. We randomly allocated people into the groups. But what do you think about, should it be relevant to their day job, or is it better to be random?
It depends what you want to get out of it. So if, for example, you're trying to train people up in a particular area, you probably want it to be relevant to their day jobs, at least for most of the scenarios. If, on the other hand, you're trying to get general awareness of security, mixing people up now and then is a brilliant way to do it, because they will be exposed to those different perspectives. And if you've got a few experienced people in the teams and then inexperienced ones, one comment that we've consistently had is that it's been extremely useful for people to be on a response team with experienced people, because it really is quite a strong learning experience. I know that we had one person on with Dennis in one of our second to last scenario, who said that it was absolutely fantastic to him and taught him a whole load of things that he never really considered before, and gave him a very different view on security. So there is value in mixing it up. There's certainly value in mixing it up for awareness, and particularly if you're doing importance of security across a company. If you're doing it to train a particular department, maybe keep them mostly assigned to something relevant to their role, but still probably shuffle a few around just so they've got those other perspectives to consider. Okay. Next thing, you've got your stakeholders. So you now need to pull out your incentives. And this is probably one of the most important things you do. You have to decide for each stakeholder what's driving them forward. This isn't a case of you have to write out 200 KPIs with a full dashboard. It's as simple as what is the core thing behind your movements in this scenario. So for a red team, it might be money. Fairly straightforward. For a blue team, it might be money in a slightly different way. It might be boredom, it might be curiosity, it could be competition if you wanted to go full industrial espionage. Various different options. For the blue team, it might again be money. It might be that their bonus is dependent on keeping a certain amount of uptime. It might be that they're meant to have a certain number of, or no more than a certain number of security incidents. It might be that an IPO is coming up and there's other things to consider. And management may have very different motivations as well. And this is why it's important, because if those motivations don't align fully, you will get all of those conflicts pulled out, and it will tell you exactly where you might need to really examine your KPIs in a real scenario to try and get everyone pulling in the same direction. Because if you are saying to your technical people, no, uptime is all, then that will be the thing that's pursued, and that might mean that when a decision to shut something down comes up, they are choosing to keep it up at a higher risk and to higher eventual damage because it affects the numbers less. So getting realistic but simple motivations is important here. Okay. And almost as important is the constraints. These can be specific constraints, such as you cannot shut down these systems without approval from senior management. They could be broader constraints where you can interpret it yourself. So one that we've used for Red Team before is you are at about the level of script kiddies. You've got some basic knowledge, but you are not sophisticated attackers. And then the Red Team were allowed to interpret that themselves and ran with that. And it did very much change the scenario as well, particularly in combination with the motivation. But constraints are almost as important as incentives because they will, again, shape the way that the story goes and shape the way you're exploring the incident. Once you've got all of those, the next step is moving on to growing the seed. And you just dig out the detail here. You've got fundamentally everything that you need. A single paragraph to brief each of the teams, each of the stakeholders on this is how the scenario starts for you, here are your motivations, here are your constraints, and allocating that out to each team. And again, a single paragraph just on this is what's actually going on in the background, and the only person who needs to know that is the person sitting in control and the moderators of each team, because the stakeholders themselves will not necessarily know. Often the red team will have more information than anyone else because they, up to the start of the scenario, have been the active participant, and the scenario is kicked off when an IOC is picked up by someone. But sometimes that won't be the case. But yeah, everyone has a brief, you have the truth of what's going on behind it, and everyone has their constraints, their incentive, and here is what you are seeing at the start.
So every team gets a brief, and the red team's brief is a bit longer than the others because they need to know more.
Yes. But the briefs take a few minutes to run through with people, maybe as much as 10 if you wanted to go very in depth. That is really how I actually build out the scenarios. That's all that's in it. So are there any questions before we go on to the worksheet? which is hopefully still up and running.
About what you just mentioned, you said running the brief with each team. Do you do that in the whole big session, or do you do that with each team separately?
So you want to do that with each team separately in most cases. You might be able to brief all of the blue team together with the red team, because the red team already know everything, so it doesn't make any difference to them. But you will probably want at least the red team to be briefed privately. You may want different stakeholders in the blue team to be briefed privately as well, because they've got different information, different views of the organisation. And good news, the worksheet is up. So yeah, and any questions, and then we'll go into that.
Can you paste the link into the chat window as
Yes.
well? This is the interactive part, so everyone should go and fill in the worksheet.
Yeah, it's my website. I promise there's nothing malicious there. So if everyone can stick their hand up or something when you've got to the quiz sheet or the worksheet.
It's in the chat, right? Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, so we don't, do you put some data or we don't? That's just the pages, right?
Yeah, if you just wait for it to load, it takes a few seconds. Okay, so once everyone's there, we can just run through it together. So the scenario seed is a few words up to a sentence of what's the core of this idea. Is it something about ransomware? Is it an ICS compromise? Is it your Alexa has turned evil? Is it that someone's taped a knife to your Roomba? What's the core of the idea? What's actually going on behind everything, and what kicks it off? And then once you're happy with that, the next one is, who is your main character, or what is your main character? What's the organization that's being targeted that is central to whatever scenario you're building?
So we need to fill this with our own like ideas, right?
Yep. Yeah, this is just to work through your own ideas.
Okay.
This is pretty much the exact process I go through when doing it. So it is a very simple worksheet, but hopefully you'll see that it does come together.
So we imagine a scenario, put answers in there, right?
Yes.
And that's to be finished now.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I mean, it is entirely optional, voluntary participation only. But if you've got any ideas for scenario, I've got a few of these. What I will be doing is anything I have in these. So if you want to keep it top secret and private, don't put it in here. But any scenarios I build out of these seeds will be going on to the GitHub repository for the security by scenario project, which is the OSS project that led to this.
So James, a quick, still a comment on improvement. I think it would be good to add a paragraph or like a couple of lines below each.
Yep, describing it.
Yeah, even in terms of like what you said, like, so the seed should be, you know, a couple of words, right? The main character is X, the stakeholder. It's almost like, you know, seeding a little bit the answers on, you know, what you're looking for, you know, like you said, the main character is the company or the target, you know, a couple, you know, do you looking for, you know, a set of bullet points, a set of stuff, or
Yeah.
so I think it'll be good to just beef this guy a little bit.
Yeah, I was actually well, I threw this together in a rush, but I was going to talk through as we go. So stakeholders will be a list of the interested parties, and again, you will want at least one blue team party, if you're doing a multi-team one and at least one red team, you probably want to go heavier on the blue teams and on the independent teams than on the red, because if you start going multiple red teams, unless you're going for, say, multiple APT groups at each other's throats, which could be an interesting one, then it's just going to be utter chaos. And if you just do that as a comma separated list or bullet list, whatever makes sense to you. And then once you've got that, yep.
Right. So people might be watching this as a replay. Will this link be up for later?
Yes, it will. People are welcome to just put ideas in. Any of the ideas may end up being part of the project repository when I have time to build them out there.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and for each stakeholder, if you just pick an incentive of some kind, might be more than one, might just be one, could be annual bonus, could be performance KPIs, could be I just want to cause chaos because I'm a bored teenager in lockdown. Whatever you want it to be. You could go full nation state with it. Seems excessive for most scenarios, but will apply to some main characters or corporations.
So on stakeholders, do you want a one-to-one mapping with the stakeholders?
Ideally, yes. You could do single incentive for blue, single incentive for red. It does make for a more interesting session when you've got slightly varying incentives for the blue team.
Yep.
And then constraints, optional, but any constraints you want to put in, whether that's about technical capabilities, whether it's about performance or resourcing abilities, or whether it's about there are certain things you will not do or are not authorized to do. Long form answer is fine there, short form, again, whatever makes sense to you. And then finally, fleshing it out, just a few sentences to elaborate on it. As I said, I will be looking at these and taking them on to flesh them out fully. I'm more than happy once I've tidied up the responses to put them in the repository as just the seeds, just the skeletons of scenario, whichever one works. But just a few sentences to go into a bit more detail now that you've run through it a bit. And then we'll crack on with the final piece, which is how you take that scenario and run it as a session.
Okay, on if you click on report abuse, where it says I clicked on it and I lost everything, so apparently close the thing. So I'm gonna need to retype it, but just to let you know.
Yep.
You can test it.
it will do that. Microsoft inject that into everything on Microsoft Forms now, because anything else
That's just
could be your
curiosity.
password. Yeah. No, that's down to Microsoft. If you report abuse, it reports that the form is being used for phishing.
Yeah, that's gone.
But you can use this form at any time. Do feel free to just use it to work through ideas or deal with ideas however you want to.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll do that.
Now, since we've only got about 10 minutes left, I'm going to crack on with running the session. So you've now got an idea of how you might build one, and probably have a seed of an idea for doing exactly that. How do you actually use it? Well, first of all, you have to get some people together. That helps to start out. But the bit that it all depends on, and this is where you get the drawback of that complete freeform, is your control team or your control person. They are absolutely key, and the scenario will only be as good as they are at coordinating it, at responding to different things going on, and at keeping the narrative moving. So unlike one of the ones where you've got the branching script, you need people who know how these sorts of scenarios work so that they can talk people through it. Ideally, you need people with some experience in gaming and storytelling, frankly, because they can keep it moving, keep it engaged, and throw in enough wrinkles to make sure that if one team is absolutely nailing it, they have a few extra difficulties so that they can explore more. And if one team is struggling, they can soften it on them, because we don't want one team to just win and the red team to crush everyone, because you don't learn anything that way. You learn by being challenged to a point where you can do something. So it's managing that level of difficulty. So your control team really are your trainers and educators as much as they are anything else. And their role, if you've got multiple teams, their role will be to coordinate all of those teams and to keep the scenario updated in the background. If you've got a single team, their role will be essentially to play usually the red team as well, so that they can keep on throwing challenges and keep the scenario moving. If you've got multiple teams, you will also want each team to have a moderator. The moderator should be someone with some experience who is independent of the team, but can translate what they're doing into actions to go back to control along some sort of back channel. And then they can make local decisions. If someone says, okay, are we using this system? Well, yes, all right, because we don't care about the specifics of the system because it doesn't make a difference to the scenario. So they can answer questions locally to keep things moving. But if the team want to do anything wider, that should go through control, because then control can say, okay, you're going to contact a newspaper, I will get the press team and let them know that you're doing that. And then they can keep that updated in the background.
How much are you feeding the red team? Not at the beginning, but during. Do you give them the steps, or do they come up with the steps, or is it a mixture?
So far, I've found that the red team is usually coming up with the steps, because usually it's people who actually work blue team who get really excited about being the red team, and they really enjoy it, and sometimes get carried away, don't they, Dennis?
Yeah.
But no, usually the red team haven't needed as much support and feeding, but that doesn't mean they won't. And if you've got people who aren't used to that sort of environment, they will need the extra support. So your moderator for the red team should be someone who is aware of what a red team would do, and they can support and help people. And if the team is just able to say, well, I don't really know what we could do, they could then present a few options, because you've got to keep it moving. Okay. Then limiting bandwidth. And this is vital. This is the only way you can have a control person able to respond effectively and keep the scenario moving and keep it realistic. The team's only point of interface with each other should be through a moderator. and therefore through control. So they are isolated from the rest of the company effectively and can only interact through that moderation interface. So you limit that bandwidth. If it turns out that two teams are basically saying, well, that doesn't make sense, at this point we would go and sit in a meeting room together, fine. Put them in a room together, and then any interactions they have with the outside world are again through that moderator. But it has to be anything to do with the scenario, goes through moderation, goes to control, gets a response from control, and therefore it has to be limited bandwidth, because otherwise if you've got more than one team, it is simply overwhelming for the person who is acting as control. I can vouch for that. And if you are running it as control, delegation is really important. If it's not something that impacts on the wider scenario, leave it up to the moderator. Just say to them, your call. So they act as an interface for the teams. The teams discuss and come up with the actions they want to take and feed it to the moderator. Moderator feeds that to control. Control goes, okay, here are the consequences. This is what you see happening. And that's also important, because the red team might see something completely different to what the blue team see. Or the media might see something which the red team have also seen, but management and blue are completely unaware until the story breaks. 4 minutes, I can do this. The session format, you will recognize this little circle. We have the story begins, which is the scenario briefing. We have the crisis, that's the breakout rooms. These have been run on Zoom so far, so it's generally been a breakout room for about 20 minutes, then back together for 10 minutes to have a update on what's going on from control and from each team, what they've been doing. New briefing, back to the breakout for the next phase of the scenario, and just repeat. So far, every scenario has come to a sort of natural resolution after about 3 20-minute breakouts. That doesn't mean everyone will, but it seems to be a quite natural stage for them to get to, where it's then comfortable to say, okay, you've taken all of the effective actions that you could. You're now looking at longer term things, and we can discuss that in the cleanup rather than in this intense thing. It's also that at that point, you've been in quite an intense bit of pressure. If you're in a blue team or any of the teams where there is quite a lot of stress involved, for an hour total with only short respites, which might not be respites because they might be, oh, the situation's getting worse between them. So 20 minutes, 10-minute breaks to get updates seems to be about the right length. 2 minutes. One variant which has been suggested is time travel. So if one of the teams does something that causes it to absolutely fail, let's say they revoke a root certificate, which means that they can no longer interact with the system, but neither can the red team. You can allow time travel. You can say, okay, you've effectively shut down the attack. You're now in longer term recovery. You'll need to go and talk to AWS to get them to give you access to your account again. But you've dealt with it. Here are the consequences. You could then say, let's just rewind and see what would have happened if you hadn't done that, and carry on again from there. That's a variant that's been suggested. It's not been tested yet, but it's an interesting idea. Finally, creating impact. A big part of the reason this is quite an educational way to do it is because people do get stressed, they do get emotional, they do get invested in the teams. As humans, we get involved in stories. We are very good at that. And you need some very small things to really have an impact on people. So, for example, a fake news headline can make all the difference. Literally just going to a generator, throwing a fake news headline together and saying, here you are, this is what's come up. And you do that while they're in their 20-minute breakouts because someone reported something to the press team. So you just go back into the room and you have that image on the screen, or you have a tweet from the attackers or a tweet from customers, tiny little things, but they do just get a reaction from people, get people involved. And when people are emotionally involved and engaged, they learn better and faster. There we go. And here's just a few different places you can go to generate that sort of thing. So tweets, social media pages, or social media posts. You can get safe profile pictures of people who aren't real that you can stick on the attacker's one so that you're not using real ones. Funny to use real ones sometimes, but best to avoid it. Newspaper clippings and news story headlines. And there we go. 0 minutes to go. So that's the hour. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions and discuss and talk about it more, but ran to time just about.
You did great. We did start like 5-6 minutes late, so you are actually very on time. So questions, comments.
Yeah, really good. Really like it. We need to put this in practice now.
I am going to rework that worksheet and stick it up on the GitHub repo as a worksheet just to use, so people
And
can
when
build their
people
own out.
fill in that worksheet, it goes to your account, or where does it go?
Anyone in that worksheet, it goes to my account. It's my Office 365 account, so only I in my company have access to it, which means only I have access to it, and it's
does
just
it send
stored.
a copy to the people themselves?
No, not at the moment, because I'm not asking people for email addresses, so I've got no way to send them on. But what I will do is make sure that now there's a decent number of responses there, I get them neatened up as here's some scenarios to start off with, and again put them up in the GitHub. If anyone objects to their scenario being there, just let me know. I can easily strip it out of the results and I can send it to people if needed.
Cool.
Cool.
And if there are any further questions, you know where to find us. We're on Slack. We have a Secure by Scenario channel on Slack, so you can always ask any questions about this there. Thank you all very much.